Hi guys, welcome back to chapter 23. In this chapter, we will learn the little details and what to watch out for when doing a render. Now, we have put a lot of effort into making our scene, our shaders, textures, models, lighting, and all that is so that in the end, we can have a really good render. So we don't want to mess up the render in any way which would be detrimental towards all the efforts that we've made previously. So without further ado, let us begin. So first, when you're making a render, we have to make sure that we are using our GPU to render, because the GPU renders much
faster
than if you're using your CPU, which in this case, I have my RTX 3090 turned on, and for the OptiX, it's also turned on. So this is for the denoise, and this is for the actual render. With a CPU render, you can look up to 5 to almost 10 times as long as you are rendering with your GPU. And this time length is from personal experience. Sometimes it could be even longer. So always to watch out for that. And then once you've edited your preferences, go here. We're using cycles, and we are using the GPU compute. So this way, your system will be using your GPU to render instead of your CPU. With that said, we are moving on to the next part that we have to watch out for, and that is the resolution of our render. So right now, the render, I've set it as 1920 by 1080, so it's the standard HD format or size or resolution, however you want it, and this will produce you a render that is about this big. So if you zoom in closely, there's not that much you can see. Yeah, a lot of details are neglected because the image is too small, but from far away, it looks okay. So if you want to have an image that is clear in a lot of places, then you would want to up this resolution. And by easily, you can type in ×2, and at the bottom ×2. And you will have this resolution changed. Also, if we move to one of our scenes, we have our borders. If you do divide it by 2, the monitor will also change the border. And if you divide it by 2 on the bottom, it'll go back to where it was before. So with this, you can easily just change however screen you want to render. For example, if you want to render a square image and crop out the dimensions yourself, then you can just render a square one and then just cut it out yourself. And similarly with this, you can do ×4 to produce a higher res square image. So that is that. And usually, if I have to render this as a final scene, I just put this to ×4, and then work from here. But remember, when you turn on a higher resolution, the render time would also increase. And in this case, since we times it by 4, the image size is actually 8 times bigger. So yeah, just remember that. Okay, and now we'll move on to our next part, which is here, the sampling and the noise threshold. So if you notice here, our viewport, the noise threshold is 0.1 and the render is 0.01. So the lower this number goes, the more times, the longer it would take to render, but at the same time, the more clear your image would be. Such as here, what is noise? For example, this is me rendering out at 4096 as at this setting, at the HD setting. So you'll notice that there are a lot of little noise in here. So that's the noise threshold. So the lower this number is, the less noise you'll have, because with cycles, it's calculating every ray trace that hits the object and bounces. So if you have a lot of say roughness or a lot of metallic in your scene, and it would need to calculate all the different bounces, especially if you end up using the glass BSDF shader for the glass parts, then that would be even longer. So that's why usually for render we change to our mix shader of glossy and transparency. And this here is the max number of samples. If you increase the samples, if you say ×2, then you'll have also a longer time to render, but at the same time it's sampling more of the rays that are being bounced off of your materials, so you'll also have a better and clear image. But usually I like to just leave this alone because the return is too less for the amount of time that you spent in rendering, because with noise threshold higher and with the max samples higher, you're looking at like a multiple times longer rendering time, whereas the amount of noise inside your image wouldn't look that much better. So if you really don't want these noise, you can either just up the size of your image. So the bigger the size, the noise in comparison would seem smaller. And at the same time, you can also just turn on your denoise for your render, just like what we do with our viewport. Because if you turn on the viewport and let's turn off denoise, you'll see that there's a lot of little noises and it's really unclear. So with denoise, it's like magic. It turns your noisy image into something that is readable through the system. It has its own sort of algorithm that that can make the image somehow really clear. So this is basically denoise versus undenoised, and it works the same way in render. Just that for your viewport, you can turn on OptiX. So this is using your GPU to denoise, and it's much faster, but at the same time it's said to be not as clear as if you're using OpenImage. So OpenImage is clear. It's the one with that I think came from Intel. So it has a better algorithm for much clearer interpretation of your noise, but it takes longer. So use this for your render, as this will use your CPU, and use your GPU for denoise with OptiX for your viewport. And now we'll talk about something that's really useful, especially when you are previewing your renders. This should have been talked about much sooner, but I kind of forgot and left it until now. So here is a tab under the render properties, and it's called Simplify. So what it does is when you click Simplify, it allows you to simplify the amount of subdivision interpretations, child particles, as well as texture. So for your viewport, you don't want so many max subdivisions because you're just doing a preview, as well as the screen size is probably too small for you to see too many subdivisions. So you can limit this to 2, and this will greatly reduce the amount of the time for your preview. As for the child particles, this is, for example, our hair. We made a lot of children particles, and that amount you can reduce. If you bring it to half, then you'll have half of the amount of particles in your scene. And for textures, you can also limit the amount of textures. For example, in our preview, we can just limit ourselves to 2K textures. So all the 4K textures would be reduced to 2K. So in our preview, it'll be much faster when it's loading, as well as the volume resolution. So if you have fog and that you don't want to see so much fog because fog takes up also a lot of render time, you can just reduce this amount by half, and you'll have half as many volume. And similarly, for your final render, you can also reduce the amount. So if your system is running low on memory, or if your video card or your graphics card GPU is running also low on memory because this scene is really heavy with a lot of geometries and like 4K textures. You can also limit this to 2K because a lot of times, unless you're rendering huge images and you're doing a really close-up view of a texture, like for example this, if we're zooming into the ground like really close and it's producing the bumps that you need and stuff, okay, so 4K is enough. But usually, like what we have right now, if you're so far away from everything, so 2K is actually more than enough. But yeah, you can also set this to no limit if you have the amount of GPU. And also here you can limit the amount of particles and subdivisions. Okay, so let's try to limit our viewport to 1K map. So as you can see here, there's not too much of a difference in our viewport display with a 1K map and a 4K map. And at the same time, there's less memory consumption, and that the render times does seem to have gone up a little bit, moving around in the scene. And next, I'm going to be talking about light paths. For here, you can change the amount of transparent, as we talked about, I think, with hair imported from DAZ, because it's using a lot of alpha map. Then you can turn the transparency high, then the hair particles would show. The lower the transparent, the less bounce it does through the alpha map or through the black and white alpha textures that you have used for transparency. So with this, you'll have a better quality of an alpha map if you have complicated stacked hair cards that are using alpha maps. So that's light paths and the total amount of light that bounces. So usually we can just leave this still, and if we have something with lots of alpha maps, we can just turn on this to 40 to 50, then that would be nice. And next is this color management. So right now we are displaying as sRGB, and there are different ways of displaying, so that's something interesting. And then we can also change here. Right now we are using the view transform of standard. Sometimes you'll have your Blender default setting at Filmic, so you can always go about and change this setting, because Filmic, it makes it look a lot like film, so a little white out. There's a little whiteness in your color. It's a little washed out, so it's like film, but it looks overall like more balanced. But if you use the standard one, then you'll see the actual colors that you've been playing around with, and the brightness would also be affecting more obviously. And next, we'll be seeing things through the false color. So with false color, what you're seeing here is sort of like a heat map. Okay, so what is showing in red is parts that are overexposed right now. So there are too much light, and the ones that are purple or black are the ones that are underexposed. So those are the two extremes. And yellow is also a little bit of too much brightness. So what it does here is that you can change your exposure by tuning it down, so your scene is mostly made up of blues and greens. Then that would be the best. Green is the best, or light blue. So if you want to find a good balance, for example, if we tune it like this, and let's go to our view, then you'll notice how there are no more overexposures on our rabbit banners as well as the backlight here. So these are the parts that would now seem a lot more evened out. And your darkness would appear more dark. And then, yeah, so this is evening out your entire scene's exposure based off of parts that are overexposed. So it's a little dark. And you can also set this to 0, and we can control this in Photoshop. Okay, so now with that being said, we can go back to our view here, and then we can just start rendering. So when you're rendering, you can go here to the output properties, and this is your output settings. So you can find a file. You can click this and set up a file path to where you want to save your renders, as well as here. So here you can choose the kind of image settings you want. If you notice that if we have rendered an image before, you'll always at the bottom here like have to select. Let's go to the rendering here and save image. You'll always have to choose, here what you want to save as, and every time you save a new image, it would turn out to also be PNG. Well, if you go here and you set your setting to JPEG, now every time we go to the render tab and we save an image, it'll be JPEG. So you don't have to go on and do your selections all over again. And when we are doing a render, the file type that we use the most would be either JPEG, PNG, or OpenEXR. And the best format to render is actually OpenEXR, because it allows you to save the most amount of color depth, which allows you to further modify that in Photoshop, which we will get into later. So usually we use RGB because that's the one showing the color. The B and W is for grayscale images or black and white images. And RGBA is for that if you have an image that has an alpha, which I will show you here. Suppose we created this image. It has an alpha. So when we go to our Photoshop, the background is transparent. And if you want to, have a red background, then you can do that. So that is what A is for. And similarly with PNG, you're also given this option. So for RGBA is when you have no background and you just want to save the image, which then you can, Photoshop in a different image or use a color for the background. And RGB is when you want your background to just be black, because the default transparency will turn out to be black. As you see here in the render. Let me find a good example. Okay, I don't think I rendered anything in JPEG. But yeah, so the default would be black, and if you set this as this, it's not gonna have the background cut out for you. And the compression would be the amount of compression that you want for your image. The higher the compression, the smaller the image size, but then you'll have maybe a little less quality of an image. So usually I leave the compression to 0, so we get the highest quality. And for OpenEXR, it's the same thing. Zip is it's a zipped lossless file. So it's actually really nice because you're not getting too much loss in your quality, but then it's still zipped, so you have a less size for image. Or you can select this to none, which means there are no zipping, and the image would be really, really big. Okay, so as I said, we'll be rendering out mostly in OpenEXR. We'll be rendering out in PNG, and if you're doing fast renders, you can just use JPEG because this is the smallest quality that you want. So here's an example of EXR versus PNG. So both of them at right now looks the same, but you can already see that this is a lot more brighter than this. So you have a lot more contrast and details in the EXR already, but we still can't see too much of it. But where EXR really shines is that when we, right now this part just appears completely black, and the skirt, there's no details. But if we turn this really, really bright, we'll notice that here we still have that texture pattern here that we can clearly see, and that for the skirt it's still really clear that we can see the folds and the reflections and everything. Now let's go to our PNG. With PNG, if we turn the level to as bright as what we had before, you'll start to see that first of all, there's no more contrast in our skirt. I mean, there's no more details that we can really see. Everything is just blotches of black, as well as obviously here, the most darkest parts, it's completely like just noise. So we can make a comparison between the two right now, and that you'll see that there's clearly a lot more details right now in our EXR file. And with this turned up to be really bright, we can then further refine the kind of details that we want. For example, if I really want the detail of the skirt, I can, add enough brightness to it. So I can do this, say so if we make a direct comparison between the two, it's quite obvious that EXR does preserve a lot more details as compared to PNG. And this is quite obvious because one, the PNG is only 190 megabytes at 7680 by 4320, and the EXR is 368 megabytes, so almost twice as much. So that's why it also preserves a lot more of the details. So we can do an experiment where we have this, and now let's convert this to 16 bits, because for Photoshop to work, a lot of times it needs to be at 16 or 8 bits. And we can change this down to this. Okay, and now we can try to recreate the same level of darkness that we have as our view in Blender. So I think it's about this dark, and we can also go here and just change the saturation a bit so it's about the same. I think the saturation is still a little too bright, but it's more or less roughly the same now. And even here you see that there's a lot more details on the texture as compared to the PNG. Okay, so now if I really want to show some sort of detail in the skirt, I can just simply go here with a mask and keep the flow down and just simply brush this. So now I'll have a skirt that even in the dark we have a lot of definition on the folds, whereas here it just completely is blotches of black. So that's also why EXR is just better. But it's not that one is better than the other, but that you can also layer them together. So if you really want to go for what you have in the render, such as like this, obviously looks a lot more realistic, because in reality you don't have so much contrast in your textures. So you can always just layer this on top, and if for the parts that you really want details, you can just go here and just mask it off so you get the detail from your EXR. And then for the ones that you really like from your render, you can just keep it from your PNG. So that's one of the techniques that I really like to use. So by layering them, we can mix the two together. So now we have the definition we need. Okay, so this will come into the Photoshop chapter, which is next. So now we go back to our render. Okay, so this is for rendering a still image. I will not be going to rendering an animation, but what you do is you can go here and choose your animation type here. And usually if you want to make an MP4, just make it this FFmpeg file, and then you go to encoding and just change this to MPEG-4, and you'll have your video here. Okay, so now once you're done your render and you want to have to select different objects for you to highlight out in Photoshop, you know how it would be really difficult to make a cutout for everything you do. Now there's an easier way of doing that. And usually in programs like Maya or others, you can render out like a key for your material or your objects, so it'll automatically generate different colors so you can highlight them easily in Photoshop. However, in Blender, that is a little different. That's a little different. At least for me, I haven't found the best way. But what I do is usually, you know, if you want it to be quite easy, you can just go to random, go to flat, and for here we can just turn off the outline, and we have an image like this where you can easily highlight out the different objects by selecting just the color. So you can go in and start adjusting it based on different objects, or if you want, you can also go to materials. Well, it's hard to see without the outline now. So if we select the body, the building, and we select the building tile, we can give each individual materials a different color. So here we go scroll all the way down to viewport display, and we can give it like a pink. And for our AC, for the main part of our AC, we can also give it another color, maybe this bluish color. And for the intake, we can give it a yellow color. So all these are there, so you can, you know, highlight your different colors more easily, and that is selection by materials. And similarly with our glass, if we want to have the glass a different color, just go here and just give it an orange. So you can assign a different viewport color to all the materials inside your scene to better help you. And once you have done that, just to take out the outline, and you'll just have the colors here. And now how to save this image, or actually save any of your viewport images. Just go here and viewport render image, and now you have a nice and clear image of your viewport, and you can go here and save as. And the size of your viewport render is also affected by here. So the bigger the number here, the bigger your viewport render would be. So with all that being said, the next thing that we have to do is simply click render image. So with your correct lighting selected and everything check, so that your render, what you want rendered, has a camera turned on, and what you don't want to be rendered with the camera off. Just go through all that in your list, and you are ready to render your image. So just click this and render image, and it's gonna, yeah. So when you render an image, the top portion will have the information. For example, here we are rendering our frame 110. You can have your frame anywhere as long as the poses aren't affected by your frame count. And the amount of time that has already been spent is 45 seconds, and what's remaining, and the memory consumption of your GPU, the peak consumption, and which view layer you're using, which we are using the view layer of our scene, and the amount of samples. So here the number of samples would increase the time spent for your render. And while you're rendering, you can also do this. There are different slots for you to have your render. For example, we can render this scene out in slot 1, And then we can go here and then press render again, and then you'll have your render to slot 2. So here you can easily switch between the two by pressing the row of numbers on top of your keyboard. And then if you make some changes here and there, you can have the two render and just make a direct comparison between your slots. And we will wait until the render is finished. Okay, and now that the render is done, we can finally save this. So let's do save as, and we'll go to here and go to this folder, and then we can do 1-1. And it is here you can save your format. I think right now, before we had it as PNG, right? So then here, now we'll have the PNG here, and then the color management, we can use the override here to override the filmic or standard color, or we can just follow the scene here. So for this, we'll have RGB because we don't have any alpha maps, no transparency, and you can change the color depth to 16 and have the compression down to 0, and we can save the PNG, or go to JPEG, save it as 100% quality, or OpenEXR, full RGB, zip lossless, and just save image. And you can save multiple different formats, like an EXR and a PNG at the same time. And once you do that, you are set and you're ready to go. So you have your EXR, although with EXR you can't open directly without some specific viewers, I think. So if you want to just pass along this to your phone, it's still best to have a JPEG because it's the file is much smaller. And yeah, with that being said, this is how to produce a render. And on the off chance that you have completed your render and you realize there's a small part that you really need to change, so you have to re-render. So rather than rendering the whole entire image again, which could take up to hours, you can simply do this. Just press Ctrl B like this, Ctrl B, and you can highlight the part that you want to render again. So once you see this orange border, now just go and click render, and only this will appear. And if you want to cancel this, you can just press Ctrl Alt B, and the border will be gone. So then we can take a look. Suppose that we want to re-render part of scene 1, and we just want to have this little bit rendered. So just do this and press render. So now our render view is this small, and now the render is loading. And when your render finishes, you'll see that this has now become this. So this is exactly the placement of where the border we drew is. So now you just go and save as, but this time you want to save either RGBA or this OpenEXR is RGBA, because we are now with the whole portion of it being completely invisible. So once you save this as invisible piece, for example, let's do RGBA, and I'll just have a color depth of 8 with lots of compression, so the file's small. So I'll just call this -X, save. Okay, so this has finally saved. Let's open up our Photoshop, and I'm gonna bring this -X into the piece. So then, because we have, let's do this again. So because it's rendering the entire frame, but everything else is is invisible, so only that portion now is being patched onto our entire image. As you see here, there's a little slight change in color. That is the piece that we have just rendered. And I will just make it a different color so you can see. So yeah, when you're piecing a random piece that you need to re-render, just save as RGBA, so everything else is invisible and you just need to piece this part in. Yeah, that is all for this class, and I will see you guys in the next one, where we will be going to Photoshop and editing the renders that we just did. Okay, guys, have a good one. I'll see you in the next chapter. Bye bye for now.